The wind carried their laughter across the frozen yard, sharp and cutting as the January air itself. She could hear them through the cabin window, three neighbors huddled by the woodpile, voices raised in disbelief. They thought she was joking when she told them she'd spend tonight in a snow trench, maintaining 18 degrees Celsius inside while the thermometer outside plunged to 20 below. Their expressions shifted from amusement to concern to outright mockery. One of them, a thick-set man named Burke, shook his head so hard his fur hat nearly fell off. "You'll freeze to death," he said flatly. "That's not how snow works." She didn't argue. The Huntress had learned long ago that words meant nothing out here. Only results mattered. Only what you could prove with your hands and your knowledge and your willingness to face the night exactly as it came. She simply nodded, sipped her coffee, and began gathering her gear. Let them laugh. By morning, they'd understand. The sky was already losing its color, that pale winter blue draining toward silver. She had maybe 3 hours of workable daylight left. 3 hours to select the site, excavate the trench, construct a proper roof system, establish ventilation, and prepare her bedding layers. It wasn't much time, but it was enough. She'd done this before, though never with an audience and never with something to prove. The stakes added weight to every decision, sharpened her focus. This wasn't about showing off. This was about demonstrating that knowledge trumped bravado, that understanding thermodynamics and snow physics could turn a hostile environment into a survivable one, even a comfortable one. She stepped outside and felt the cold wrap around her immediately. 20 below wasn't a figure on a screen. It was a physical presence, a pressure that found every gap in your clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Her breath formed dense clouds that hung in the still air for a moment before drifting apart. The neighbors had gone inside, probably to watch from the warm side of their windows, to place bets on how long she'd last before giving up and trudging back to the cabin. She ignored them. Her mind was already working through the checklist, the sequence of tasks that would transform a patch of snow into a microclimate capable of holding heat. First, site selection. This was arguably the most critical decision, the foundation everything else would build upon. She walked slowly through the property, reading the landscape. Snow depth was good here, over a meter in most places, more where it had drifted against the tree line. But depth alone wasn't enough. She needed consolidated snow, not the fluffy powder that had fallen 2 days ago. She needed structural integrity. She tested several spots with her boot, pressing down, feeling for resistance. Too soft here, too icy there, probably an old melt layer. Finally, about 40 meters from the cabin, in a slight depression sheltered by a stand of black spruce, she found what she was looking for. The snow here was dense, the kind that had been worked by wind and temperature cycling, compressed into something that would hold a shape, that would insulate rather than collapse. She marked the perimeter with her poles. The trench would run east to west, roughly 2 meters long and 60 centimeters wide. Not too wide. She wanted her body heat to fill the space efficiently. Not too narrow. She needed room to move, to adjust her position if something went wrong. The depth would be critical. Too shallow and she'd lose heat to convection, the cold air flowing over the top. Too deep and she'd struggle to ventilate properly, risk carbon dioxide buildup if she used any kind of heating device. She was aiming for about 80 centimeters deep, maybe 90 depending on how the excavation went. The shovel bit into the snow with a satisfying crunch. This was good snow, the kind you could work with. She began carving out the trench systematically, throwing each load to the downwind side where it wouldn't blow back in. The work warmed her quickly, too quickly. She paused, unzipped her jacket halfway, pulled off her outer gloves to work in her thin liners. This was a critical lesson most people missed. Avoid sweating at all costs. Moisture was the enemy in cold weather. Sweat would soak into your base layers, kill their insulating properties, then freeze against your skin when you stopped moving. She needed to stay just slightly cool while working, maintaining that delicate balance between comfort and efficiency. As she dug, she explained the physics to herself, rehearsing the principles that would keep her alive tonight. Heat loss happened through four main pathways: conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. Conduction was direct contact. Lying on cold ground would drain heat straight from your body into the earth. Snow was actually an excellent insulator when used correctly. Those microscopic air pockets trapped between ice crystals created barriers that slowed heat transfer. But you still needed a platform, something to lift you off the bottom of the trench, to add another layer of dead air space. Convection was about air movement. Wind was the great thief of body heat, stripping away the warm boundary layer that formed around your skin. The trench would block wind entirely. Radiation was heat escaping as infrared energy. This was where a reflective layer would help. Why she'd brought that emergency blanket with the metallic surface. And evaporation, well, that was why she was being so careful about sweat. 40 minutes into the dig, she'd excavated about half the trench. Her shoulders were starting to burn, but the work felt meditative, purposeful. Each scoop revealed the stratification in the snowpack, the subtle layers that told the story of this winter. A dense crust from a warm spell 3 weeks back, a layer of graupel that had fallen during that strange freezing fog event, the powder from last Tuesday's storm sitting on top. She was cutting through seasons, through weather patterns, carving a space in accumulated time. She paused to drink water from her insulated bottle, forcing herself to take slow sips even though the cold made her want to gulp. Hydration was crucial. Dehydration made you more vulnerable to cold injury, thickened your blood, reduced your body's ability to generate heat efficiently. She'd pee more often, which was annoying in 20 below weather, but it was necessary. Small discomforts now prevented major problems later. The second half of the excavation went faster. She was finding her rhythm, and the deeper she went, the more protected she became from the rising wind. Yes, the wind was picking up. She could hear it now, a low whistle through the spruce branches, feel the temperature dropping as the sun sank toward the horizon. The sky was turning that particular shade of winter evening, a deep blue-gray that seemed to emanate cold rather than reflect it. She needed to hurry, but she couldn't rush. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes out here could be catastrophic. Finally, the trench was complete. She stood at one end, looking down at her work. The walls were clean, nearly vertical, the bottom relatively level. She'd sloped it very slightly toward the entrance to allow any meltwater to drain out, rather than pool under her sleeping bag. Now came the platform. She gathered spruce boughs from the surrounding trees, cutting them carefully with her folding saw, selecting the thickest, most robust branches. These would form the first layer, creating an air gap between her and the snow floor. She laid them perpendicular to the trench's length, weaving them together to form a stable mat. The evergreen smell was sharp and clean, cutting through the neutral scent of frozen air. On top of the boughs, she laid her closed-cell foam pad, the kind that didn't compress, that maintained its insulating properties even under body weight. Then her inflatable sleeping pad, which she filled carefully with her breath, watching for any signs of frost forming on the valve. The combination would give her an R value of around 8, which meant heat would transfer through the platform roughly 8 times slower than it would through air alone. Good enough. More than good enough. Next, the roof system. This was where things got interesting, where the real thermal engineering came into play. She couldn't simply pile snow on top of the trench. Too much weight and the walls might collapse inward. Too little and heat would escape readily into the open air. She needed a structure, something that would trap warm air while allowing just enough ventilation to prevent suffocation and condensation buildup. She'd brought several components for this. First, her tarp, a heavy-duty silnylon sheet 3 meters by 2 meters treated to be waterproof. She stretched this across the top of the trench, staking the corners securely into the surrounding snow. The tarp created a sealed airspace, a pocket that would hold heat. But sealed spaces were dangerous. Carbon dioxide could accumulate. Even without a stove or candle, her own respiration produced CO2, and in high enough concentrations, it could kill you in your sleep. So she made sure to leave ventilation holes. One at the head of the trench, about the size of her fist, punched through the tarp and the snow she'd pile on top. Another smaller hole near her feet. This would create a flow, cold air sinking in at the lower end, warming as it passed over her body, rising and escaping through the upper hole. The flow would be gentle, almost imperceptible, but it would be enough. Enough to keep oxygen circulating, enough to prevent the buildup of moisture from her breath. Now, the insulation layer. She began piling snow on top of the tarp, working carefully to distribute the weight evenly. She aimed for about 20 centimeters of depth, packing it down gently with her gloved hands. Snow had an R value of about 1 per inch, so 8 inches would give her another R8 barrier between her microclimate and the open air. Combined with the tarp's windproofing properties, this would be formidable. She left the ventilation holes clear, marking them with small sticks so she could find them in the dark if she needed to adjust them. The sun was gone now. Not sunset. True gone. That abrupt disappearance that happened in northern winters when the sun didn't so much set as simply vanish behind the curve of the world. The temperature was dropping fast. She could feel it in the way her breath plumes hung longer in the air, in the sharpness of each inhale. Her thermometer read -18 and falling. By midnight it would hit 20 below, maybe colder. The neighbors' cabin lights were warm rectangles in the distance. She wondered if they were watching, if they'd placed any faith in her preparations, or if they were already composing the story they'd tell tomorrow about the foolish woman who tried to prove a point and failed. Time to prepare her sleeping system. She organized her gear at the entrance of the trench, working with the efficiency of long practice. First, her vapor barrier liner, a thin, waterproof sock that would go on the outside of her sleeping bag. This was counterintuitive. Most people thought sleeping bags should be waterproof on the outside, but the VBL worked by trapping moisture inside before it could migrate into the bag's insulation. Yes, you'd wake up slightly damp, but your bag would stay dry night after night. And dry insulation was the only kind that worked. She'd be using a 20 below rated bag, which meant it was designed to keep you alive at that temperature. Not comfortable. Alive meant you'd survive but be cold and miserable. She needed comfortable, which meant she'd supplement the bag with additional layers and heat sources. Before climbing in, she changed her base layers. This was tedious in the cold, stripping down to add a fresh merino wool top, but it was essential. The shirt she'd been wearing during the dig was damp with sweat. She stuffed it into a stuff sack, sealed it away where it couldn't rob her of heat. Her fresh layer was bone dry, and she could feel the difference immediately. That restored efficiency of insulation against skin. She added a fleece mid-layer, then her down jacket. On her legs, she wore merino tights, soft shell pants, and had her insulated pants ready to pull on once she was in the bag. Her feet got the same careful attention. Fresh wool socks, then vapor barrier socks, then thick insulated booties. She'd keep her boots inside the bag with her, tucked down by her feet. If they froze solid overnight, she'd never get them back on. Now, the heating elements. She'd brought 2 Nalgene bottles filled with near-boiling water, wrapped in wool socks to prevent burns. These would go in the bag with her, one at her core, one at her feet. Together, they represented maybe 2,000 kilocalories of stored heat energy, heat that would radiate into her sleeping system for hours, well into the night. She'd also brought a small emergency candle in a metal tin, but she'd use it only if absolutely necessary, and only with extreme caution. The tin would sit outside the sleeping bag, vented carefully, watched constantly. A candle flame produced carbon monoxide as well as heat, and in an enclosed space it could be deadly. But it could also raise the ambient temperature by a few critical degrees if things got desperate. She slid into the trench feet first, arranging her gear around her with practiced movements. The sleeping bag went on top of the pads, and she climbed in fully clothed, pulling the VBL over everything. The hot bottles went in their designated positions. She'd brought a lightweight emergency blanket, the kind that looked like metallic foil, and she draped this over the top of her sleeping bag, creating another radiant barrier. Heat her body produced would reflect back down, rather than escaping upward. She'd also brought a small thermometer on a string, which she hung near her head so she could monitor the temperature without moving much. Finally settled, she did a mental inventory. Water. Check. 2 liters within reach. Food. Check. Energy bars and jerky in a bag by her head. Headlamp, check. Fresh batteries tested. Knife, check. Clip to her jacket. Emergency whistle, check. She had her phone in a waterproof case tucked into her inner pocket, keeping it warm against her body. If something went catastrophically wrong, she could call for help. But she wouldn't need to. This would work. It had to work. She activated a small digital thermometer she'd positioned in the most accurate spot, near her chest level, away from her breath, but within the sheltered air pocket created by her sleeping system. It read 3 degrees Celsius, not bad for a starting point. Outside, according to the remote sensor she'd placed on a stick beyond the trench, it was 19 below. 22-degree difference already, and she hadn't even begun to warm the space with her body heat. The first hour was always the hardest. Her body needed time to generate heat, to warm the dead air trapped in all those insulation layers. She could feel the cold creeping in at the edges, at her shoulders, around her face. Her breath formed frost on the inside of the sleeping bag's hood. This was normal. She'd expected it. She ate a chocolate bar slowly, mechanically, forcing her body to metabolize those calories, to convert chemical energy into heat. She drank water in small sips, staying hydrated even though it meant she'd need to pee soon, probably multiple times throughout the night. Around her, the night came alive with sounds. The wind was steady now, a constant presence, but from inside the trench, it was muted, filtered through snow and tarp into a soft whisper. Occasionally, a stronger gust would send snow skittering across the roof, a sound like sand on paper. The trees creaked and groaned, thermal contraction making the wood fibers adjust to the dropping temperature. Far off, she heard the sharp crack of a tree splitting, sap frozen and expanded beyond what the cells could contain. It sounded like a gunshot, flat and final. She checked her thermometer. 5 degrees, rising slowly but steadily. Her body was doing its work, putting out roughly 100 watts of heat even at rest. More when she moved or when her metabolism kicked up to combat the cold. That heat was being trapped, accumulated, building in the small air volume around her. The snow walls and roof insulation were holding it in. The platform was preventing conduction loss into the ground. The system was working exactly as the physics predicted. But comfort was relative. Her face was cold, exposed to the air. She pulled the sleeping bag hood tighter, leaving just a small opening for her nose and mouth. Immediately she felt the difference, felt that pocket of warm air form around her face. But now she had a new problem: condensation. Her breath was warm and humid, and when it hit the cold interior surface of the sleeping bag, it would condense into frost. If this continued all night, she'd wake up with a bag interior coated in ice, and tomorrow night, if she were doing this again, she'd be fighting a losing battle against accumulated moisture. She adjusted her breathing, tilting her face so her breath would flow out of the hood opening rather than into the bag. It was a small thing, a tiny modification, but these tiny things accumulated into success or failure. The difference between staying warm and hypothermic was often just a series of minor adjustments, each one addressing a specific heat loss pathway, each one building on the others. 2 hours in. The thermometer read 8 degrees. She was starting to feel genuinely warm now, that deep warmth that came from core temperature rising, from her body relaxing its defensive posture. The hot water bottles were doing their job beautifully, radiating heat that her sleeping bag trapped and held. She'd positioned the one at her core carefully, against her stomach, where blood vessels ran close to the surface. Warming blood at the core meant warming blood that would then circulate to her extremities. Her toes, which had been numb cold an hour ago, were tingling back to life. She urinated into a wide-mouth bottle, a process that required remarkable contortion inside a sleeping bag, but was far preferable to getting out and exposing herself to the night. The urine steamed as it hit the bottle, and she screwed the lid on tight, tucking it into a corner of the trench where it wouldn't spill or freeze. She'd deal with it in the morning. Another chocolate bar, more water. Her body was a furnace, and she was feeding it fuel. maintaining that metabolic heat production that was the ultimate source of all the warmth in this tiny snow cave. The night deepened. Above the trench, the sky was probably spectacular. That crystalline clarity that came with extreme cold, stars burning with unfiltered intensity. But she couldn't see them. She was in her own world now, a pocket universe of controlled temperature, insulated from the hostile environment by layers of material and air and understanding. It felt oddly safe, cocooned, despite being buried under snow in 20 below weather. Or perhaps because of it. The snow was her ally, not her enemy. It was doing exactly what she'd asked it to do. Hold heat in and cold out. 10 degrees Celsius, 11, 12. The temperature was climbing faster now, approaching the point of equilibrium where her body's heat output balanced the heat loss through the insulation layers. She'd calculated that she could realistically maintain somewhere between 15 and 20 degrees inside the trench, depending on variables like wind, her metabolic rate, how well the insulation was working. 18 degrees was her target, her proof point, the number she'd casually mentioned to the neighbors knowing they'd think it was impossible. But then, the wind changed. She felt it before she heard it, a subtle shift in the pressure around the trench. The whisper of air moving over the roof changed pitch, became sharper. Then came the spindrift, that fine, powdery snow carried on high winds, finding its way into gaps and openings. She heard it hissing against the tarp, felt the temperature drop slightly, as cold air found new pathways into her shelter. The ventilation hole at her feet, which had been drawing in a gentle flow of fresh air, was now pulling in a stream of wind-driven snow crystals. She could see them in the beam of her headlamp, a glittering cascade that was accumulating on her sleeping bag. This was a problem. Not a crisis. Not yet. But definitely a problem. The spindrift was introducing moisture into her carefully controlled environment, and it was disrupting the thermal stratification she'd worked so hard to establish. She needed to address it quickly before it spiraled into something worse. She reached up carefully, feeling along the tarp's edge for the ventilation hole. The wind was howling through it now, a small jet of Arctic air. She stuffed a spare sock into the opening, blocking about 80% of the flow while still leaving enough gap for ventilation. The spindrift stopped immediately. The temperature began climbing again. But her heart was pounding, adrenaline cutting through the drowsy warmth she'd built up. This was the reality check, the reminder that she was engaged in a technical exercise with real stakes. Everything could change in moments. A slightly worse wind shift, a structural failure of the roof, forgotten piece of wet clothing that froze into uselessness. Out here, there was no margin for major errors. You survived by catching small problems before they became large ones. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to let the adrenaline metabolize. Panic used energy and clouded judgment. She'd handled the situation correctly, quickly, efficiently. The system was stable again. She checked her remote thermometer, 22 below outside. Inside, 13 degrees. Still climbing. The math was working. Midnight approached. She could feel it in her body, that circadian low point where energy flagged and doubts multiplied. Her shoulders ached from the digging. Her neck was stiff from lying in one position too long. She needed to shift, to adjust, but movement meant disturbing the carefully arranged layers, risking cold air infiltration, letting the warm microclimate she'd built around her body escape. She compromised, moving slowly, methodically, maintaining contact between her sleeping bag and the pads, keeping the VBL sealed. Small movements. Roll to the left, pause, let the system reestablish equilibrium. Roll back, flex her toes inside the booties, rotate her shoulders. These micro-adjustments prevented stiffness without sacrificing warmth. Something was moving outside. She heard it clearly, a soft crunching in the snow, rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps. Her hand moved to the knife at her side before her rational brain caught up. Animals didn't walk that steadily. It was probably just a branch settling under snow weight, or ice cracking in the trees, or her imagination turning wind sounds into threats. But no, there it was again. Closer now. Definitely footsteps. She unzipped the sleeping bag partially, stuck her head up toward the entrance of the trench. Cold air slammed into her face, shocking after the warmth of her cocoon. She clicked on her headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating snow, shadows, the dark silhouettes of spruce. For a moment, nothing. Then movement at the edge of the light. A dark shape, too low to be human, too large to be a rabbit. Red pine marten, she realized with relief. The animal paused in the headlamp beam, its eyes reflecting green gold, curious but not frightened. It had probably smelled her food, was investigating this strange snow-covered anomaly in its territory. They regarded each other for a moment, hunter and hunter. Both creatures adapted to winter survival, but using vastly different strategies. Then the marten turned and bounded away, disappearing into the darkness with that distinctive looping gait. Her heartbeat gradually slowed. Just an animal, just the forest going about its nocturnal business. She was a guest here, nothing more. Back in the bag, she sealed herself in and waited for her core temperature to recover. The brief exposure had cost her. Dumped the carefully accumulated warm air out into the night, let cold rush in to fill the vacuum. Her thermometer read 9 degrees now, down from 14. Frustrating, but predictable. She'd rebuild the warmth. Her body was still putting out heat. The water bottles were still radiating. The insulation was still doing its job. It would just take time. She ate more food, mechanically working through the calories. Trail mix this time. Nuts and dried fruit and chocolate chips, each bite deliberate and purposeful. Chewing generated heat in her jaw muscles, digestion generated heat in her gut. Every system in her body was contributing to her survival. Billions of years of evolution fine-tuned to maintain a core temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, regardless of external conditions. All she had to do was give those systems the fuel they needed and protect them from overwhelming heat loss. The rest would happen automatically. 14 degrees, 15, 16. The climb back was slower this time, the system working harder to compensate for the disruption. But it was working. That was the key insight, the lesson she wanted people to understand. Winter survival wasn't about being tough or enduring suffering. It was about understanding the mechanisms of heat transfer and systematically addressing each one. Conduction, platform and pads. Convection, wind block and sealed shelter. Radiation, reflective layer. Evaporation, moisture management and dry clothing. Get those 4 factors right, maintain them throughout the night, and the human body would do the rest. She dozed, not deeply but in that half-aware state where consciousness flickered in and out. She'd set a mental alarm to wake herself every hour, to check the ventilation, to verify the system was still stable. This was crucial. People died in snow shelters not from cold but from suffocation, carbon dioxide accumulation, or from having their ventilation holes sealed by drifting snow. She couldn't afford to sleep soundly, not tonight, not with something to prove. 2 a.m. The coldest part of the night when heat loss from the earth reached its maximum, when even the ambient air temperature dropped that extra few degrees that separated uncomfortable from dangerous. Her thermometer outside read 23 below, but inside 17 degrees. She'd hit her target. Almost. 1 more degree and she'd have the proof she needed, the undeniable evidence that knowledge and preparation could overcome skepticism and conventional wisdom. She ate again, forcing food into a body that wasn't particularly hungry but needed the fuel. Her water was getting low. She'd drunk more than expected, sweated more during the build, despite her precautions. Dehydration would make her more vulnerable to cold injury, but there was nothing she could do about it now. She had enough to last until morning. Barely. She'd budget it carefully, small sips spaced out, enough to keep her hydrated without running out before dawn. The silence was profound. The wind had died down to almost nothing, and in that stillness, the cold seemed to deepen, to become something more than temperature. It was a presence, a weight, an absolute that surrounded her tiny bubble of warmth. She could feel it pressing in, patient and relentless, waiting for any crack in her defenses. But her defenses held. The snow walls were solid, compressed by their own weight into something approaching the density of ice. The roof system was stable, sagging slightly under its snow load but not failing. The ventilation holes were clear, drawing in fresh air and expelling her breath, maintaining that critical balance between oxygen and warmth. 18 degrees. The thermometer climbed to 18.2 Celsius and held there. She'd done it. The system had reached equilibrium. For the remaining hours until dawn, assuming nothing changed dramatically, she'd maintain this temperature inside the trench, while the world outside remained locked in the deep cold of a northern winter night. The math had predicted this outcome, but seeing it manifest in reality, feeling the warmth on her face, the comfort in her extremities, the absence of shivering, that was vindication of a different order. Theory had become survival. Knowledge had become life. She allowed herself to sleep more deeply now, confident that the system was stable. Her body relaxed into the warmth, muscles that had been tense for hours finally releasing. She dreamed fitfully, fragments of images, the neighbors' faces, her hands digging through snow, the pine marten's eyes reflecting in the darkness. Through it all, her unconscious mind maintained its vigil, monitoring sensations, ready to wake her if something went wrong. False dawn came first, that subtle lightening of the eastern horizon that preceded actual sunrise by an hour or more in winter. She woke naturally, her body sensing the approaching end of night. She felt remarkably good, all things considered. Not refreshed exactly, but functional, alert, warm. Her muscles were stiff, but not painfully so. Her throat was slightly dry from breathing cold air all night, but not raw. Her toes and fingers responded immediately when she flexed them. No numbness, no tingling that might indicate the early stages of frostbite. She checked her thermometer one final time. 17.8 degrees Celsius. Close enough to call it 18. The outside temperature had started to climb with the coming dawn, up to 19 below from its overnight low. The differential was nearly 37 degrees Celsius, maintained for hours by nothing more than snow, air, fabric, and an understanding of how heat moved through matter. She began the methodical process of breaking camp, reversing the sequence that had built this shelter. Sleeping bag opened, body allowed to cool gradually rather than shocking it with sudden cold exposure. Layers adjusted. She stripped off her down jacket now that she'd be moving again, added her shell layer to block wind during the dig-out. Boots on, laced carefully, feet still warm from spending the night in the bag. She drank the last of her water, ate another energy bar, gave her body one last load of fuel before the physical work ahead. The excavation took 20 minutes. She dug out from the feet end of the trench, tunneling through the entrance drift that had accumulated overnight, emerging into the blue-gray light of early morning. The cold hit her immediately, but it felt almost refreshing after the night's confinement. She stood slowly, joints creaking, and took in the landscape. The world was locked in frost, every surface rimed with ice crystals, the trees standing like white sculptures against the lightening sky. Behind her, she heard voices. The neighbors were emerging from their cabin, bundled in heavy coats, breath steaming in the frigid air. They approached cautiously, perhaps expecting to find her hypothermic or defeated, ready to admit that she'd been wrong. Instead, they found her methodically packing her gear, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd had a successful night, not a desperate one. Burke arrived first, his expression caught between concern and curiosity. "You actually stayed out here all night?" he asked, as if he couldn't quite believe what his eyes were telling him. She nodded, allowed herself a small smile. "Stayed warm, too. Want to see the numbers?" She retrieved her thermometer, showed them the overnight readings she'd logged on her phone. Maximum outside temperature, -18. Minimum, -23. Inside the trench, at the sleeping zone, between 16 and 18.2 degrees Celsius for most of the night. She watched their faces as they processed this information, saw the skepticism slowly give way to something else. Not quite belief, not yet, but the beginning of understanding that maybe, just maybe, she knew what she was talking about. "How?" Burke asked simply. She walked them through it, the whole system, explaining each component and why it mattered. The platform to prevent conductive heat loss, the snow walls and roof to block convection, and add insulation with an R value of about 1 per inch. The tarp to create a sealed but ventilated airspace. The ventilation holes to prevent carbon dioxide buildup. She stressed this point, made sure they understood that sealed snow shelters without proper ventilation could kill you. The reflective layer to minimize radiative heat loss. The hot water bottles to provide supplemental heat. The vapor barrier to manage moisture. The dry base layers. The high-calorie food to fuel metabolic heat production. Each element working together, creating a system where the sum was greater than the parts. But 18 degrees? Another neighbor, a woman named Sarah, shook her head in disbelief. That's room temperature. That's comfortable. It's not heating the whole trench, the Huntress clarified. It's a microclimate, a small pocket of air right around the sleeping zone. The snow walls are still well below freezing. But that small volume where I was sleeping, where I was breathing, where my body heat was concentrated, yes, that got up to 18 degrees. And that's all you need. You're not trying to warm a house. You're just trying to warm the air immediately around your body. And you're trying to keep that warm air from escaping. Do those two things well enough, and you can sleep comfortably in conditions that would kill you otherwise. She could see their minds working, recalculating their assumptions about winter, about survival, about what was possible with the right knowledge. This was the moment she'd been working toward, not the smugness of being right, but the opportunity to teach, to share information that might someday save someone's life. But she was careful to include the warnings, the qualifications. This isn't a game, she said seriously. If any part of this system fails, if your clothes get wet, if your ventilation gets blocked, if you're not eating enough to maintain metabolic heat, if a storm buries you without you realizing, you can go from comfortable to dead in hours, maybe faster. Every decision has to be right, every detail matters. And you have to know when to abort, when to admit that conditions are beyond your skills or your gear or your physical state. Pride doesn't keep you warm. It just makes your funeral more expensive. She showed them where she'd placed the ventilation holes, explained how to position them to create airflow without creating drafts. She demonstrated how to test snow for the right consistency, how to cut blocks if you wanted to build walls instead of digging a trench. She talked about site selection, about reading wind patterns, about how to identify dangerous avalanche terrain where building any kind of snow shelter would be suicidal. She explained the concept of R values, how insulation worked at the molecular level, why multiple thin layers trapped air better than one thick layer. She discussed the vapor barrier debate, acknowledging that some people hated them but explaining why they were crucial for multi-night trips, where accumulated moisture would otherwise destroy a sleeping bag's effectiveness. The neighbors listened, asked questions, began to understand that this wasn't about toughness or endurance. It was about applied thermodynamics. It was about understanding that heat was just energy in motion, and if you could control how that energy moved, you could survive almost anywhere. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, sending long golden rays across the frozen landscape, she finished packing her gear. The trench would collapse under its own weight in a few days, or the next storm would fill it in. Either way, it would return to the landscape it came from, a temporary modification that left no permanent mark, just as it should be. Burke extended his hand, and she shook it firmly. "I'm sorry we doubted you," he said. "And thank you for explaining all this. I learned more in the last 20 minutes than I have in 20 years of winter camping." She nodded, accepting the apology and the thanks with quiet grace. "Knowledge is survival," she said. "Everything else is just suffering." As she walked back to the cabin, gear slung over her shoulder, she felt the satisfaction of a job well done. Not just the survival itself, but the sharing of knowledge, the transformation of skepticism into understanding. That was worth more than any personal achievement. That was how humans survived as a species, by learning from each other, by passing on techniques and insights, by building on the accumulated wisdom of generations. She'd spend today recovering, resting her tired muscles, rehydrating properly, organizing her gear for the next trip, because there would be a next trip. There always was. The wilderness was her classroom, her laboratory, her proving ground. Every night out taught her something new, refined her techniques, deepened her understanding of how humans could adapt to environments that seemed hostile, but were simply indifferent. And now, as she looked back at the neighbors gathered around her collapsed trench, examining the snow, discussing what they'd learned, she felt a different kind of warmth. The warmth of community, of shared knowledge, of people taking survival seriously not as a macho challenge, but as a practical skill that demanded respect and study. The thermometer still read 18 degrees when she'd emerged from the trench. That number would stand as proof, but more importantly, it would stand as invitation. An invitation to learn, to question assumptions, to understand that with the right knowledge and careful preparation, the impossible became merely difficult, and the difficult became routine. This is what winter teaches you if you're willing to listen. The cold is not your enemy. Ignorance is your enemy. Fear based on misconceptions is your enemy. But knowledge, preparation, and respect for the environment, these are your allies, more reliable than any gear, more valuable than any equipment. Master these, and you can thrive where others merely survive. If you found this story valuable, if you learned something about snow shelters, thermal management, or winter survival, consider subscribing to this channel. We explore the edge where knowledge meets wilderness, where technique transforms suffering into comfort, where understanding physics means understanding survival. There are dozens more stories like this one, each containing practical information that could save your life or simply make your next winter adventure more enjoyable. The comment section below is for your questions, your experiences, your own techniques. Share what you know. Learn from others. That's how we all get better at this ancient game of staying alive in the cold.